Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea Bierman, and this is the Learning Bear Podcast, your resource for wild professional development. Today, I will be discussing the headaches of migration. First, what is migration, anyways? Migration, the simplest definition of migration, is just an organism moving from one place to another, but it's rarely ever that simple. It's not going to be moving from point A to point B. It's usually going to be point A to B, C, D, and then E is your final destination. So you have those stopover sites in between. I like to think of it as when my grandparents migrated to Florida for the winter. Their nesting site, their home of sorts, was in Indiana, and then they would start to migrate, and they would stop somewhere in Alabama or Kentucky as their stopover site, usually a hotel, and then they would migrate on down to Florida, okay? And they lived in the southern part of Florida, so sometimes they had to take extra breaks in between. No amount of snacks or gas in your car is going to allow you to go from Indiana to Florida without stopping. You're going to have to go to the bathroom. You're going to need to get some coffee or some more snacks or just stretch your legs or change drivers, right? And the same thing goes for birds. And we're going to talk briefly about other species that migrate, but most of this podcast is going to be about birds, okay? So birds, they need to rest, right? Or they need food, or they need water. If they're traveling with adolescent birds, those adolescent birds aren't going to be able to fly as long as older birds that have their muscles completely developed. So you need these stopover sites between their nesting and their wintering habitat. And basically, if you look at it on a map, it kind of becomes like a string of green spaces between their nesting and their wintering habitat. And these are called stopover sites. There are some other vocabulary words you kind of want to be aware of. You want to know about limiting factors when you're talking about migration. Limiting factors are any living or non-living element that restricts population growth. And typically it's referred to as abiotic or biotic factors, but a living thing that could inhibit a population from stopping there and from growing and continuing can be the influx of a different species into that habitat. Okay, perfect example of this, my father-in-law has a pond, right? And for several years, these groups, like one or two families of geese, would come and they would have their goslings and they would teach them how to fly on the pond and the whole 9 yards. It was adorable. It was so cute. And last year, the geese didn't come, and it was weird. And my father-in-law found out it's because some snapping turtles had wandered their way into his pond. And he's since relocated the snapping turtles. So I wonder if the goslings and the geese will come back this year, but it's a real life thing. These snapping turtles are known for being kind of aggressive and mean, and so they would probably very easily eat a gosling. Okay, so the geese knew that problem was there, and so they didn't stay there anymore. That's what happens at these stopover sites. If there's an influx of invasive species, or even something as simple as raccoons or mink that have kind of destroyed the habitat, the geese can't stop there, and so they have to keep flying on. And that's why it's important there be a complete string of green spaces, because if they do need to move on, they don't have to go super far. I'm sure we've all been in a car where, you rolled up to a hotel or a campground and you're thinking, that's kind of sketchy. I don't want to stay there. So you have to keep going. And then you're in the car for another 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. And you're like, all I want to do is take a shower or get some food or just take my shoes off, right? Same thing for these birds. They don't want to fly an extra 2 hours or an hour. They want it to be a quick next stop, 20 minutes in the air or something. A non-living limiting factor is simply water. It's a very simple example, but it's very relevant. Think about how much rainfall we get or don't get in a year. If we get too much, then the plants aren't adapted to take on, not all plants are adapted to take on a lot of water, and so they're going to die because they were overwatered. Everybody's probably been guilty of overwatering their houseplants and it turns yellow and it dies. That happens. It's a real issue. Okay. Same thing on the other end of the spectrum. If they don't get enough water, they're also going to die. I'm sure some of us have probably killed houseplants because we didn't give them enough water. Same situation. So if there's too much or not enough water, then these birds can't stay there. Okay. So whether it's a raccoon or a snapping turtle or the plant's not kosher, they have to go on. And when you're an adolescent bird, you may not be able to go on. It's a struggle because you're not fully developed. Okay. So those are some limiting factors. Leading into habitat, another vocabulary word, and habitat is just everything that we need to live. Okay. And typically in school, I think we really just focus on food, water, and shelter, but that's not really all it is. It's also air and space. If you don't have air, it doesn't even matter if you have the rest of them because you're not going to survive. And when it comes to space, well, you can't build a house if you don't have the space to build a house, right? So you need space. And birds need space too. If there's only space for 20 nests and then you have 22 birds, well, that's a problem. Okay? They can't all fit there. So there has to be adequate space, adequate air, adequate food, water, and shelter available. And if any one of those things isn't available, then you got to roll on to the next place. Think bringing back to a campground or a hotel. You get to a hotel and it's booked up. You didn't make a reservation. There's no vacancy. Well, you got to go on to the next one. Or you go to a campground and it's full. Well, we can take you tomorrow, but we can't take you today. You got to roll on. Okay, there's no room for you. And if you've been flying or driving for lots and lots of miles, that's really the last thing you want to do, right? So the last vocab word that I want to bring up, and it's particularly relevant to the birds that we're going to talk about, but it's an important word to know in general too. That would be a wetland. Okay, what are wetlands? They are habitats typically in low-lying areas near watercourses like a river or something. And a lot of times, because they're so fertile and they're so nutrient rich, they actually get turned into farmlands. And there was a statistic, it might be kind of old now, but like 60% of wetlands were disappearing every year. So that number of wetlands that we have available is smaller and smaller each year. Wetlands are up there with coral reefs and rainforests as far as their productivity goes. They're very important habitats, especially for migratory birds and shorebirds and waterfowl. So I like to compare them to Walmart. Okay, we all know what Walmart is, or some big superstore, whatever. Okay, Walmart has your food, right? It has your water. It has a pharmacy if you're sick. It has vitamins if you want to prevent yourself from getting sick. If you're going to go camping, they can provide you with shelter. If you're raising babies, they have stuff for your babies. You can have a whole nursery, whether it's a baby human, a baby dog, a baby cat, birds, whatever baby you have in your life, they can help you make a nursery. Okay. They also have stuff to repair your shelter. If you need to paint your walls, if you need to fix your curtains, your blinds, your windows, your landscaping outside, anything that you want to do to fix your shelter, really, aside from maybe 2x4s and plywood, they can help you out. Wetlands are the same thing. They are an incredible shelter for a lot of animals, both bugs, fish, birds, mammals, all of it, amphibians, reptiles, whatever. Then they're a great nursery, a great place to grow your kids. Okay, it's like that special little small town vibe. Okay, you take your babies there. There's a playground, the whole thing. Then they're nutrient rich and fertile, so you get all your good vitamins, minerals from the plants there. They absorb tidal forces when an area has been wreaked by like a hurricane. Okay, it's just been completely wrecked, and so they absorb a lot of that extra water like a sponge. They also balance the pH in the water so that the water is safe for those animals to live in. So they're very, very important. and they're really the Walmart of the natural world. So as I mentioned, we are going to focus mostly on birds because of the culminating activity that I want to talk to you about. But there are also other species that migrate. First, butterflies, and I'm sure you're probably aware of monarchs that migrate, but they're not the only ones. Painted lady butterflies migrate every year too. A couple years ago, they made the news because a 500-mile wide, I don't know what a flock of butterflies is called, but whatever it's called, a 500-mile wide group of butterflies, painted ladies, showed up on weather radar because it was so thick and so big they thought it was a storm. Turned out it was just a bunch of butterflies migrating. So monarchs are famous. We know them because their populations are dwindling and they're endangered, but there are other ones that migrate too. Fish also migrate. Again, salmon are famous. They go upstream to spawn and then they come back down. Then there's sea turtles. If you live in a coastal state, you probably are aware of sea turtles because they're very popular. Leatherback sea turtles can migrate up to 10,000 miles. Famous trek is from Baja California to Japan, so that's pretty crazy. And then just a kind of fun jumping continents for a second, wildebeest also migrate. Now they don't migrate as far as a leatherback sea turtle, but they do migrate, okay? And of course there's many more. This is not a complete list of migratory species, and the number of birds that migrate is, I could talk 15 minutes about the number of birds that migrate. So we're just going to lump everybody together and say birds, okay? So in order for a migration to be successful, certain things have to go right. Unfortunately, due to humans and environmental impacts, it can change how successful a migration can be. And not all of these things are negative. Some of them are, fair number, but not all of them. Some negative ones can be where a marsh is dredged to turn it into a marina, light pollution, an increase in like mink or raccoons, like we were talking about with the snapping turtle example. Deforestation, which is when forests are logged faster than they can reproduce, and then changes in legislation also affect that as well. Some positive things, though, most of it comes down to education, but we did talk about how sufficient rain or snow combination kind of determines whether or not a habitat is available for birds to stop at. But there's some other things that can also affect that. If you live in, say, like a farming state, an agricultural state, you can talk to your farmers about flooding their fields in the off-season to create a habitat while these birds are migrating. And then, when migration's over, farmers can do whatever they want with their land. Okay, very simple thing, but it can make a huge impact. Education about conservation and preservation management, properly managing, okay, and hunters and fishermen abiding by the restrictions for hunting seasons is really important. And it seems like pretty simple stuff, but my parents let people hunt on their land, and not everybody follows the rules, and my parents have to call them out on it. So education plays a huge role in these sorts of things, and having those open conversations in your community can develop these green spaces as well. So a real quick shout out to kind of a local organization. Well, not local to me, but maybe local to somebody. It's called Lights Out Baltimore, and it is a nonprofit program affiliated with the Baltimore Bird Club, and it's a chapter of the Maryland Ornithological Society. Their goal is to help make migratory birds safe by turning off unnecessary decorative lighting during peak migration periods. Okay, and it's basically like a curfew between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. And let's be honest, most people are asleep during those hours. Not everybody, I'm not going to say everybody, but a lot of people are asleep during those hours, so you don't need those fancy lights on. You don't need decorative lighting on if you're not there to enjoy it, okay? So it's no big deal. So they make people aware of it. They have a whole bunch of other awesome programs too. This is just one of them that they do. So migratory birds are kind of like the ancient philosophers and astrologers and astronomers. they look to the heavens for guidance, right? So they look to the skies and they follow the stars to let them know where they need to go. And unfortunately, birds can't always tell the difference between twinkling lights and twinkling stars. And they're going to follow the thing that is the brightest. And the lights, obviously, are going to be the brightest. And so these birds get confused and they come into the city and they very often die, or they become injured and then they die. And so the organizations like Lights Out Baltimore, they help to rehabilitate them through partnerships with like the Phoenix Wildlife Center in Baltimore. And they also pair with some other organizations as well when they're deceased. But if we can turn off these lights during these seasons, and it's a thing for sea turtles too, coastal lighting, it's a very simple fix to save some migratory birds, keep them on their way, less injuries. And this includes bats as well. They've saved a bunch of bats too. It's a very simple way to not have this problem anymore. And so their program is actually spread to over 20 Lights Out programs in North America, including Toronto, New York, Detroit, parts of Minnesota, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. So that's really, really awesome. If your city's not involved, see if maybe you can get involved to see where migratory tracks are in your area and get into this program because it's pretty awesome. So we've been talking about migration. We've been talking about limiting factors and the headaches of migration. Well, if you haven't gotten enough migration, there's actually a really amazing game that you can play through a program called Project Wild. If you don't know, Project Wild is an environmental education curriculum and activity guide. They'll host workshops at your school or your nature center, whatever, and give you these manuals. And in their aquatic class, you can learn about the migration headaches game. And I'm going to try to explain it to you and some other activities you can do as well. If you have more questions, I'll go on to that later. But so essentially for a migration headaches game, it's a running game. If you want to wear your kids out, this is a good way to do it. You need a large playing area. If you don't have like a big playing area like a soccer field or a gymnasium available to you, just, work with what you got. And then you need a base for every student. So we're going to work within the realm of 20 students. I know it's probably small for some groups, but it's an easy number, okay? So you're going to need 3 sites, a nesting, a wintering site, and a stopover site. So if you have 20 kids and you're using, say, carpet squares, you would need 1 per kid at each location, okay? So, or one for every 2 to 3 kids at each location. So if you had 1 per 2 kids at each location, you would need 10 at each spot, so 30 total. You can use carpet squares. I like to upcycle fabric that's not being used for its original purpose anymore. I cut it into squares. I use that. You could use a bunch of like laminated paper that you have for something else. You could use Post-it notes, which isn't exactly eco-friendly, but if you upcycle them into something else, it could be eco-friendly. If you did use something smaller, then I would say probably 1 per student. If you're using something bigger, then I would say 1 for every 2 to 3 students. So we're going to work with the idea that we're having 20 sticky notes per site, 60 sticky notes total, and we're also work within the idea of a gymnasium. So a gymnasium usually has the basketball court painted on it. There's usually a basketball hoop at each end. At each end, one end will be the nesting site and the other end will be the wintering site. Pick whichever one you want. And then the center line that goes through the gym where the big circle is, that will be your stopover site. So that's where you're going to put these squares or these Post-it notes, whatever. Okay. Start your kids at either end. I usually start at the nesting site, but I believe the book tells you to start at the wintering site, whichever floats your boat or flies your bird, whatever. So you start your kids at one end, and I usually work them up slowly so they get it. Okay, every kid or participant is representing 10,000 birds, okay? Make sure you tell them that, and then you help them migrate. You say, hey, ducks, you can go ahead and migrate to your stopover site. Everybody does it nice and easy, no big deal, and then they go to their last site at the other end, no big deal. They turn around. This is when you start to kind of mess with them a little bit, okay? So then you start saying, okay, well, we had some marshes in the area that were dredged to build marinas for boats, so I'm going to take these 2 habitats away. Well, now you have 20 birds trying to get at 18 habitats. It's basically a crazy version of musical chairs. The difference is, you can take some away and work it down pretty small, and then you can add some back when there's positive things, okay? And then it's really great if you chart this. If you started out with 20, then the next time you're at the wintering site, you have 15, and then the next time you have 17, and so on and so on. You chart the changes. It really shows them how population change. And some other options too that you can do, if you're talking about migration beforehand, you can have them offer some positive and negative things that humans can do, and you can use those in your game. You can also have different clusters of students research, different birds that migrate, or different butterflies or dragonflies or whatever you want to do, and they can represent those in this game on the field. So then you can also track their numbers. If, say, 4 kids represent Canadian geese and only 2 survive at the end of the game, well, we lost 20,000 geese, okay? Yeah, that's pretty much the game. And Project Wild has a great list of habitat scenarios on their website, projectwild.org. If you have any questions about this podcast today or Project Wild, you're more than welcome to email me at learningbearpodcast@gmail.com or get on Project Wild's website and get a workshop near you. That's it for me today. I hope you enjoyed your wild professional development about the headaches of migration. Have a great day. Bye.